Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell. And this video is part of a series of videos on Proclus's Elements of Theology. I'll link a playlist here for the whole series. But today what I'm going to be focusing on are propositions 75 through 79. And as I've been doing throughout the series, I am using the E.R. Dodds translation. And so for those of you who don't have the text, there is a link in the description box that will take you to a PDF version of the text. But going now to the text, we can see that we're starting a section that E.R. Dodds has titled, Of the Relation of Causes to Their Effects and of Potency. So we're starting with Proposition 75, which reads that every cause properly so called transcends its resultant. So here he's making the case that causes are transcendent. And we can see that in explaining this, he's going to be making a reference to Proposition 64. So before we jump into this text, I think we should just quickly review what Proposition 64 had stated. Okay, so Proposition 64 is the one that states that every original monad gives rise to two series. One series that consists of substances that are complete in themselves, and another series of what he called irradiations, which have their substantiality in something other than themselves. So back when I first introduced Proposition 64, I pulled out some of the language used to describe these two categories and made this list. So you may recall that substances complete in themselves were the self-constituted, and he said that they were in themselves. Whereas what he called irradiations were those incomplete substances. They require a substrate, and they are in another. The way there are some energies that require the body here in the physical realm. And so we are returning to these two different series here in Proposition 75. So let's see what he's talking about here. He says, if such a cause were immanent in its effect, either it would be a complementary part of the effect, or it would in some way need it for its own existence, which is what we saw in Proposition 64, the idea of requiring a substrate. And it would in this regard be inferior to the effect. That which exists in the resultant is not so much a cause as what he's calling a by-cause. And he describes a by-cause as being either a part of the thing produced or an instrument of the maker. Now, being an instrument in our everyday world, of course, an instrument is something like a lawnmower is a kind of an instrument, or a builder's tools are the instruments that the builder uses. Of course, in metaphysics, we're talking about a divine instrument that would be immanent in the produced. And so this is what academics would probably call the instrumental cause. So what he's calling a by-cause is what we often refer to as an instrumental cause. He says, the several parts of the thing exist within it, but are less perfect than the whole. And the instrument serves the maker. He hasn't yet defined that, but we can see that the maker is going to be the cause properly so called, the one that is transcendent. And so there's the distinction. So the instrument serves the maker for the process of production, but is unable to determine for itself the limits of creation. Accordingly, every cause properly so called, inasmuch as it both is more perfect than that which proceeds from it, and itself furnishes the limit of its production, transcends the instruments, the elements, and in general, all that is described as a by-cause. And so we can see here that the transcendent cause is, in academia, would be called like the formal cause or the ideal cause, talking about the level of eidos. And so you have the transcendent formal cause, and then the instrumental cause, which is a divine instrument immanent in the produced. And that's what he's calling a by-cause. Now, Proposition 76, we're going to see, does actually have a link to Proposition 75. And 76 reads, all that arises from an unmoved cause has an invariable substance. All that arises from a mobile cause has a variable substance. And once again, Proclus is going to cite a previous proposition, and so we need to again jump back and do a little bit of review. This time we're looking at Proposition 26. We're going back quite a ways now. It's been a while since we've seen Proposition 26, but this is the one that read, every productive cause produces the next and all subsequent principles while itself remaining steadfast. We can already kind of see how this is going to connect to 76 because being unmoving and being steadfast, the same idea. Now I highlighted just the first sentence of the explanation here because this gives us what we need going forward here. That it imitates the one, and the one brings its consequence into existence without movement. It creates just by its very being, although I'm using being very loosely here because it's obviously prior to existence even, but just for whatever the one is, that's how it creates. It doesn't have to actually do anything. And so these other productive causes, by imitating the one, also create by their very being. Before going back to Proposition 76, I do want to take a look, though, at the corollary to 26. It explains that it follows from this proposition that the productive principles remain undiminished by the production from them of secondary existences. For what is in any way diminished cannot remain as it is. So to be steadfast or to remain as it is means to be undiminished, and that's going to be significant. Okay, so back at Proposition 76, we see here that it has two parts, talking about that which arises from an unmoved cause and that which arises from a mobile cause. So two different parts to it, and there are two paragraphs. So the first paragraph is going to show why what arises from an unmoved cause must have an invariable substance. And this one reads, for if the maker be wholly unmoved, then it produces from itself the secondary, not through a movement, but by its mere existence, which is what we just saw in Proposition 26. And if this is so, then concurrently with its own being, it must contain the being which proceeds from it. In other words, if the effect flows from it just by the cause's very being, then whatever the effect is, it must be contained within the cause in order for it to just flow from it. So it contains it within itself. And if this be so, then while it continues to exist, it continues to produce. But it exists perpetually. It's unmoved, it's steadfast. Therefore, it perpetually produces its consequent, so that the latter arises perpetually from it and perpetually exists, attaching its ceaseless procession to the ceaseless activity of its cause. And so the second half now is to show that all that arises from a mobile cause has a variable substance. And so let's take a look at how he explains this one. He says, now if on the other hand the cause be mobile, that which arises from it will be correspondingly variable in its being. For that which gets its being through a movement varies its being with the variation of the mobile cause. If being produced by movement, it remained itself invariable, it would be superior to its originative cause, and this is impossible. And the reference here is to Proposition 7. This one I've referenced so many times, I imagine anyone who's been watching the whole series has already memorized this one, that causes are superior to their effects. Therefore, the effect cannot be superior to the cause. That would be impossible, and therefore the effect must be not invariable. Therefore, it is not invariable. It will therefore be variable and mobile in its existence, imitating the movement which gave rise to it. Proposition 76 is generally recognized as tying to Proposition 75 because these unmoved causes correspond to the transcendent causes that we saw in Proposition 75, the one in the intelligibles that imitate them, whereas the mobile causes then align with the by-causes that we saw in Proposition 75, like the mundane gods whose energies are tied to the physical vessels that they embody. That these are like what in the Timaeus Plato called the junior gods. Now going on to Proposition 77, we're going to see that 77, 78, and 79 really tie together nicely. Let's take a look at 77. All that exists potentially is advanced to actuality by the agency of something which is actually what the other is potentially. The partially potential by that which is actual in the same partial respect, and the wholly potential by the wholly actual. Okay, this one is very hard to visualize, and I think the greatest difficulty, or the main cause of the difficulty that we have in visualizing this, is that we have a different notion of what is meant by potential and actual than what the Platonists had in mind. We tend to think of our physical world as the actual, and the world of forms as the potential. We understand they're more than just concepts, but we may often have heard the poetical description of them as ideas in the mind of God. So they still are being equated with a kind of concept, even if it's higher than a human concept. And that gives it the feeling of potentiality, or the feeling of being something abstract, as opposed to our concrete actual world. And if you're thinking of it this way, you're going to really struggle trying to understand what he's describing here. It would be more accurate to think of the intelligible forms or ideas as the actual. Those are absolute realities, and their subsequent unfoldings are the potential. And so the procession is from the actual to the potential. And then there is a reversion back to the actual. And that return, then, that process of proceeding and returning and becoming actual, is what you might call actualization. So if you keep that diagram in mind, I think this will be a lot easier to understand. He says that it is not in the nature of the potential to advance itself to actuality, being imperfect. So that return is not the power of the potential, because that has an imperfect power. Since if being imperfect, it became the cause of its own perfection or actualization, the cause would be less perfect than the effect. Thus, the potential qua potential is not the cause of its own actualization. For in that respect in which it is imperfect, it would be the cause of perfection, inasmuch as everything potential is imperfect qua potential, while everything actual is perfect qua actual. Now, I just want to take a moment to remind you that back when we looked at Proposition 61, we saw that things closest to the one are called unified because of their closeness to the one, and as we proceed away, we call that which is farther from the one differentiated. And when we're talking about what is closest to the good, when we're using the language of good rather than one, that which is closest to it we call perfect, and that which proceeds away from it is relatively imperfect. Now, of course, each realm is perfect at its own proper power, but it's imperfect in a relative sense, you might say. And so now we're tying the language of actual and potential to this language of perfect and imperfect, and that's what we were just looking at. And so this is the language that we're looking at here, that everything potential is imperfect as or qua potential, while everything actual is perfect qua actual. Okay, going on, he says, if then the potential is to exist in actuality, it must derive that perfection from another. And either this other is itself potential, but if so, the imperfect will again be parent to the perfect. Or it exists actually, and is actually either some other thing, or else that which the thing being actualized was potentially. In other words, the power to actualize comes from the actual. But the agent will not render actual that which is potential in the latter, if it be itself actually some other thing, for it produces according to its own character. Proposition 18, I'm not going to jump back to it. It's just the one that said that there's a monad and then its own proper chain. And the character of the monad runs through all in the chain. And so the potential must return to an actual that is of the same character. Nor will the latter be actual unless it be made actual in that respect in which it is already potential. It follows by exclusion that any particular thing passes into actuality through the agency of that in which its potentiality is already actual. What a word salad. But I'm going to jump back to the diagram because I think it'll be much easier to see what he's saying here. Okay, what's really being described here is this process of this procession and then reversion, a circular quality, if you will, that you'll find in every realm. And by the way, Proclus loves to use these triads, and so he has lots of different triangles, and we can use them to describe, for example, just the intelligible realm or just the intellectual realm or realm of soul. We can also use it within the realms to say that we want to talk about, say, just the summit of the intelligible realm. We can talk about that in a triadic sense and make a triad just for a triangle just for that and make another diagram. We can also use this diagram to show, say, the whole procession of our soul. And so we can see this in terms of our spiritual practice or our philosophical practice. And for those of us who see this as mysticism, it's a spiritual practice. Our desire is to return back to our source and to know ourselves. And that's what is being described here metaphysically. The procession down into an individual soul and the reversion back to cause. And when we return to cause or anything that reverts back, then it knows itself. And that's the process that is called actualization. And in metaphysics, this is often described as the essence or the very being of a realm or of a thing, of a soul, whatever it is that has this quality. And the Greek word for this is ousia, and I'm giving it to you here in the Greek and also in the Romanized transliteration, ousia. It's a very useful word to know. Ousia is this whole process of actualization, this dynamic quality, this procession and reversion, this circular dynamic. We tend to think of the words essence or substance as having a kind of a static quality to them. But we can see that there's actually a dynamic process going on here in this process of actualization, of knowing thyself. And that's really what's being described here. And there's a power to it. In the actual and in the potential, they each have their own proper power. And so that's what we're going to go on to discuss in the next two propositions. And so Proposition 78 states that there is a perfect and an imperfect potency. For the potency which brings to actuality is perfect, since through its own activities it makes others perfect. And that which can perfect others is itself more greatly perfect. So in other words, the power in the actual is the perfect power. But that potency which needs some extraneous presubsistent actuality, the potency in virtue of which a thing exists potentially, that's the imperfect power. For it needs the perfection which resides in another in order to become perfect by participating it. In itself, therefore, such a potency is imperfect. Thus, the perfect potency is that which resides in the actual and breeds new actuality. The imperfect is that which resides in the potential and derives its fulfillment from the actual. So coming again to this diagram then, he's saying that the power of the actual is what he's calling the perfect power. And the power and the potential is what he's calling the imperfect. And that is consistent in what we were looking at earlier, that which is closer to the good is what he's calling perfect, and now he's calling actual. And what is farthest from the good is what he earlier called imperfect, and now is also calling potential. Now he needed to set up these two potencies because that leads him to what he wants to show in Proposition 79, that all that comes to be arises out of the twofold potency. And so this is really talking about the actualization that results from that whole process that we might describe by the Greek word ousia. For the subject of the process must itself be fitted for it, and so possess an imperfect potency. And the agent, being already in actuality what the subject is potentially, must already have a perfect potency. For every actuality proceeds from the indwelling potency. If the agent should be without potency, how shall it be operative and act upon another? And if the subject of the process should lack the receptive potency, how shall the process occur? An agent acts always upon something capable of being affected, and not on any chance subject, whose nature may prevent it from responding. So Proposition 79 is really the basis for the law of providence, which states that we can each participate in the divine realms to the degree that we are able to. And so our whole philosophical practice could be described in the sense of that we are preparing ourselves for that return, if you will, to know thyself, to become actualized and to know ourselves. And so what he's describing here is that there are two different potencies. The actual has an indwelling potency, but also the receiver has a receptive potency. To understand this, just think of your own philosophical practice, your studies of metaphysics, your contemplations, any theurgic practices you might engage in. It's all to prepare the soul for that return, to be more receptive, if you will, to the potencies of the actual. And so we're seeing here that there is a dual aspect to this process, both the perfect and the imperfect, the actual and the potential. Both must play their proper parts. So as always, please let me know in the comments section if you found this helpful or not, or any questions you have, any insights you might be having along the way. I'd love to hear about it. And I thank you for watching, and I do hope you'll join me next time.